Welcome to episode 1, where we'll be answering the question, was Richard an usurper or the rightful king? The first question we will consider is, was Richard's womanizing brother, King Edward IV, already secretly married to another woman when he supposedly married the mother of the two princes, and were the two children legitimate heirs to the throne? King Edward and Bishop Stillington had a fairly decent relationship. They respected one another, and there was nothing that suggests that Stillington ever did anything deceitful or corrupt. Stillington was the only eyewitness that claimed that there was ever a pre-contract between Eleanor Butler and Edward IV. Even if Stillington had motive to release this information, he was old and close to death and didn't gain anything from exposing the secret. Historians suppose that if Lady Eleanor had no interest in making this public, that Stillington would also have stayed silent. However, when Edward died, Stillington could have feared an illegitimate heir taking control of the throne, and so came forth with the news. When considering the legitimacy of the two princes, there are two ways of looking at it. One view would be that since Eleanor had died before the princes were born, that they would be considered legitimate. On the other hand, since Eleanor was still alive when Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the two princes, her sons and her marriage to Edward would be considered illegitimate. In addition to this, there was a report that claimed that it was highly probable that Eleanor had had Edward's child, and that child would be considered the legitimate heir to the throne. However, this child never came forward, and there had been speculation as to whether this child was being kept secret or was possibly found by Richard. Despite all of this, according to the logic of canon law as it was in 1483, if there was no valid marriage, there could be no valid offspring. This would mean that Edward's sons with Elizabeth Woodville were not the true heirs, and that meant that Richard had no reason to kill the two princes.
Edward IV died when he was 41. Leaving the crown to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. The question of how Edward IV died still remains. There are theories that he was killed by Richard or poisoned by the French, but evidence shows that he likely died from pneumonia.
On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died unsuspectedly at the age of 41. On Edward's deathbed, the king had made Richard the protector of his heir. However, Richard knew using this title he could not only protect the next king, but also become the next king. Following Richard's death, the newly widowed queen immediately sent her eldest son, Edward V, to the heir of the throne, to London for early coronation. Richard hurried to intercept the young Edward before the coronation, and took the boy to the Tower of London, where, traditionally, monarchs waiting for coronation would stay. After the coronation was postponed, the younger prince was sent to the Tower of London, where he would stay with his brother, Edward V. Richard soon ordered a public announcement declaring that the late Edward IV was a bastard, thus making Edward V illegitimate and unable to rule. Richard was soon declared the King of England.
Though widely believed, Richard III did not have a romantic relationship with his niece, Elizabeth of York. Although Richard may have possibly thought of the idea of marrying Elizabeth to alternate Henry Tudor's plans of marrying her, he did not have romantic feelings or romantic relationship with his niece, as rumored. But Richard was also protecting her after the disappearance of her brothers, but not from personal feelings for her, but because of a promise he made to her mother, Elizabeth Woodville. This was because Richard had given a public oath to ensure the princess's safety and to treat them well as he promised Elizabeth Woodville. Richard also did not murder his wife to marry his niece. His wife, Anne, had been sick for a long time and had slowly been dying from tuberculosis. She was not murdered suddenly. Richard also had respect for his wife, as they had been through joys and hardships together. And even after her death, if Richard were to marry Elizabeth, it would be an extremely unpopular decision, especially in the north, where Anne's family was very powerful, since people would assume that he had murdered his wife to marry his niece. He was also urged to make a public statement that he did not have any intentions of marrying Elizabeth. Richard had also declared that Elizabeth and her brothers were illegitimate, and if he had intended to marry Elizabeth, it would not make sense for him to label her as a bastard, since it would not be logical for Richard to marry his bastard niece. And he would also not be able to consider her legitimate if he were to marry her, as it would altercate his claim to the throne.